system, and the trajectory of China's domestic and foreign policy. I'm your host, Henrietta Levin, Senior Fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. This is Pekingology. I am thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Rana Mitter, who is the S.T. Lee Professor of U.S.-Asia Relations at Harvard Kennedy School. He is a widely respected scholar and historian of modern China and the author of numerous books, including China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. This spring, he published an exceptional and somewhat provocative article in Foreign Affairs titled The Once and Future China, How Will Change Come to Beijing? And last month, he contributed a chapter on the U.S.-China relationship titled Competitive Anti-Liberalism to Hal Brand's new book, Lessons from the New Cold War, America Confronts the China Challenge. Rana, it is great to see you.
It's great to be here with you today. I'm delighted by being described as a well-respected scholar. Could you please send that description to my wife? I'm not sure she would believe it.
We'll drop it in the show notes.
Sounds good to me.
So to start off, how did you become interested in China and Chinese history?
I have to say it's a kind of decision I made very early on, actually in high school, which I can promise you is quite a few number of years ago now, back in the UK. Listeners who have been caught unawares may be able to tell from my accent that I've spent most of my life actually living and working in the UK. And when I was at school there, I decided that I wanted to go to university and I think study something that really I had no knowledge or connection with at all. So I've been growing up in the south of England. My family are of Indian heritage. I'd studied a few languages and other things as you do in high school. But I think I must have, at that time, the age of 16 or 17, just thought, I wonder if I have a chance to study something that really has almost no connection with anything that I know at all. China sounds like far away enough and interesting enough. And as it turned out, it was an extraordinarily interesting place. It still is. But it was kind of like the equivalent of throwing a pebble into a well and seeing what ripples actually make their way to the edge.
And turning to your work, in just a few weeks, we will reach the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War and the Japanese surrender. I expect we'll see a number of high-profile commemorations in Beijing and across China. You've written quite a few books and articles on the question of how the memory of World War II continues to shape Chinese society and politics, and how Chinese politics, in turn, shapes the memory of the war. So I have to take advantage of having you on the podcast to ask, how does World War II factor into the thinking of President Xi and his lieutenants today?
Well, that, I think, is a question that is not only fascinating to me as a historian, Henrietta, but I think just for this year at least, is certainly something that has genuine geopolitical significance. And that's something that I'll use to answer your question about why I think Xi Jinping is stressing this issue so much. I should just add before getting there that in some ways, we just had a word beforehand about what got me interested in China. And I discovered very early on, certainly as an undergraduate and then in grad school, that it was Chinese history in particular that I thought really added depth in terms of the way in which we in the West get some sort of multi-dimensional understanding of why contemporary China is the way it is. And the more and more I looked at the history at that time, the more and more I realized that it was one particular set of events in the 1930s and 40s, the events leading up to and during what we think of as the Second World War, that really gave, I think, insights into China and its modern history. Now, anyone listening to this podcast will know a great deal about World War II in general. It's something that runs through, America, Europe, Japan, large parts of the world in terms of collective memory. But China's role in that particular conflict is one that I think is less well known. And that, I think, is the first reason that Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, and actually more broadly, Chinese society, I think, is interested in raising the profile of its role during those wartime years. Just a quick reminder, again, I'm sure that this podcast listeners are more than knowledgeable enough to know some of this, but a very quick reminder of the kind of experience that China had during those World War II years. I mean, for China, it was a war that lasted from 1937 to 45. Europe generally starts in 1939, but in China, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, 7th of July 1937, kicks off 8 years of destruction and terror across the territory of China after the Japanese invade at that time. We don't have an exact death toll number, but certainly numbers of 8 million or above in terms of not just direct combat casualties, but also deaths caused through horrific events like the Henan province famine of 1942-43, which alone may have killed 3 or 4 million people. Those are all part of the story, along with massive refugee flights, 60 or 80 million or more Chinese becoming refugees in their own country. In other words, huge social devastation that really not only changed China, but also provided the social setting for the communists eventually to rise up and conquer in their revolution that took over China. So that's all by way of saying this is really a world-shaking series of events, not just relevant to China, and yet I think not really that well remembered in the West. If anything, perhaps the war in China is thought of as a bit of a sideshow, almost a secondary part of the fighting, and that I think from certainly China's point of view is not really the case. So when we see this commemoration that takes place on 3rd of September this year in Beijing, probably with a big parade and lots of public ceremonies, I think there'll be a couple of things probably on Xi Jinping's mind. One, I think, is genuinely a sense that telling this kind of story is something that provides a patriotic narrative that is not just about the Communist Party itself, but also about the wider Chinese nation. And it's really noticeable that although the party is still central to the way that Xi talks about China, there's been more and more talk in recent years and decades about trying to revive not just the party, but China itself. And so the wartime history can be seen as a sort of starting point for that particular story. The other thing is that I think we can confidently expect that there's going to be some VIP guests from Xi's point of view. President Putin of Russia seems to be, I think, a pretty likely guest, not least because Xi Jinping went on May 9th to Moscow and appeared at Putin's parade in Red Square in commemoration of the Soviet role at the end of World War II in Europe. Now, what other presidents of any other country may or may not turn up, we don't yet, I think, fully know. But I think that combination of public spectacle and historical memory are both going to be on Xi Jinping's mind during that ceremony.
Yeah, it did stand out to me when I was admittedly rereading China's Good War ahead of this interview, the way you highlight how President Xi really shifted the starting point of when China stood up as a great power from 1949 back to 1945, which of course is granting the nationalists more credit than they have had on the stage of acceptable Chinese history in the past.
That's absolutely right. I love the way that Henry said you're rereading the book. I hope you're rereading at least for the 14th or 15th time. That's the least I would expect from any interviewer. Well, of course, that would be nothing less than I'd expect. Very kind of you to have read it at all. I would say that, yes, it's very, very much on the minds of those who are involved with thinking about the wider significance of the war, to go back to what you might call a point of origin. Now, again, this podcast has listeners who know a tremendous amount about China, and obviously 1949 then and now remains a crucial moment from the point of view of the Chinese Communist Party, their conquest of all of China's mainland, the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the establishment of Mao's regime. And yet, it's become clearer and clearer in recent years that a more globally widely held point of origin, 1945, the starting point of what we still just about might want to call the rules-based international order, but it's looking pretty creaky in various ways from around the world. That is, of course, something that emerged at the end of World War II, 4 years before the communist victory in China. And this has become more and more important to the CCP because it enables them to tell a new story about how they have joint ownership, if you want to put it that way, of that rules-based order. So I can explain a bit more what I mean by perhaps adapting the words of one of the Americans who was most involved with the creation of that order in 1945, Dean Acheson, who modestly titled his memoirs as Secretary of State, or after being Secretary of State, Present at the Creation, by which, of course, he meant the creation of the world that would brought in the Cold War, and indeed, although it's after Acheson's death, post-Cold War as well, that post-1945 world. Now, China has never really been thought of as a co-owner, a co-creator of being present at the creation of that particular world. One of the reasons is that perhaps China's role has been rather underplayed by the Western world. I think that's fair to say. But what also is less mentioned in Beijing is that until recently, China's Communist Party didn't want to talk about that 1945 moment either, because it was a moment when nationalist China, Kuomintang China, the China of Chiang Kai-shek, actually sat in the places in 1945 when they were in the room where it happened. One of those rooms was, of course, San Francisco, April 1945, the signing of the United Nations Charter. Now, today, Xi Jinping, Wang Yi, the big names in Chinese politics, are very keen to point out that China was not just a signatory, but the first signatory to the United Nations Charter, and that gives China joint ownership, in some senses, of the modern world order. What they don't mention, of course, is that it's Chiang Kai-shek who was actually doing the signing at that point. Or if we think about the other institutions, again, creaky but still there, of international politics, the IMF, the World Bank, things that came out of the Bretton Woods Conference. Well, of course, China was absolutely in the room at that point, not necessarily as the most powerful actor, but certainly present as part of its legacy as a wartime victorious ally. But again, it's the difficulty for the CCP of having to point out that, or rather avoid the fact, that the nationalists, the KMT, were the party who were actually in the room at that time. So there's a sort of Schrodinger's sense of 1945 in terms of that wartime legacy in which China is there, but in the current commemorations, it's downplayed, if not exactly ignored, that the Chinese government that was in the room was the one that the communists actually defeated to take over in 1949.
And how does the memory of World War II affect Beijing's current thinking about Taiwan? And I ask in part because Chinese officials often claim the Cairo Declaration, for example, legitimizes their insistence on reunification. But I wonder if we should hear that primarily as a talking point. Are they retrofitting a certain legalism on a pre-existing idea of what the Chinese nation includes, or is the World War II experience and China's perceived entitlement to victor's spoils of a sort authentically shaping their sense of how Taiwan relates to the CCP project?
Well, like all the best problems of international law, the answer is complex. Beijing would like it to be simple, but it really is not. So again, just to sort of recap on what this actually is, in 1943, at the end of November 1943, three of the top Allied wartime leaders met in Cairo, the Egyptian capital, to talk about the strategy of the war, particularly in Asia. They were President Roosevelt of the United States, Prime Minister Churchill of the British Empire, and Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist leader, present for the first time a Chinese leader sat really in equal standing with those two other major Western leaders. Stalin, of course, not there, because at that point Stalin and the Soviet Union were neutral against Japan. They didn't come in until summer of 1945, nearly 2 years after that. Now, the military consequences of that Cairo conference in the end were not that significant. But in terms of the symbolism, the declaration that was signed at the end of that conference, the Cairo Declaration, as it's become known in China ever since, made a variety of statements about what would happen to territories that Japan had either conquered or taken over, what would happen after the war was over. And amongst the things that were listed was that the island of Taiwan, Formosa, should return to the Republic of China. Now, the complexities around which state represents whom have meant that, of course, there are plenty of people who would claim on Taiwan that the Republic of China is alive and kicking and right there. Both the opposition KMT, who of course has never abandoned the idea that the Republic of China never ceased to exist, it just decided to hop over to the island in 1949 and wait for a reconquest of the mainland against the communist bandits.
Any day now.
Hasn't been happening yet, but could start a barbecue or something and see if that happens. But beyond that, of course, there's the question of the ruling party in Taiwan, the DPP, who of course favor, in many interpretations, independence from Beijing. Beijing's made it very clear that they absolutely regard this as a red line. But the way that DPP spokespeople have got around this often is to say that there is this entity called the Republic of China on Taiwan, and then speak around the complexities that surround that particular term. And again, anyone who wants to can look at some of the recent writing. A lot of analysts have looked at online about how this particular term is used in terms of the DPP and KMT battling it out in domestic Taiwan politics. The point about the Cairo Declaration there is that because the People's Republic of China is not named as a separate state, it didn't exist at that point, international lawyers have had endless fun debating with each other about which particular jurisdiction it is that should actually have possession of the various Japanese possessions that are mentioned in the Cairo Declaration. The one thing that is not simply, quote marks, proved by the fact is the idea that there is a simple extension of what was written in 1943 to the Beijing government of today, even though that case is made quite robustly by Beijing in international forums where it can seek to get a hearing.
And in thinking about the relationship between history and politics more broadly, you have a fantastic anecdote in the book from 2017 when the Chinese government decides that China's World War II began in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria rather than 1937, as had been previously, something like consensus with the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And just like that, it was a fact that the war began in 1931. And textbooks had to be rewritten, and historians seemed to understand this was not something they should contest. Could you talk about this and how it illuminates the relationship between history and politics in President Xi's China?
So what you're talking about there, Henrietta, is what you might call the distinction between a historical debate, which in academic terms is perfectly valid, and a political declaration, which ends up brooking no argument. And as you know, most academics are not very keen on being told they're not allowed to argue about various things. So the historical point, just to take it on briefly, is a question of when do historians and those who read history and think about history consider that the Japanese war against China actually began? Now, for a very long time, the answer to that was, 1937, 7th of July, there's a clash between local Japanese and Chinese troops in North China, and it soon kind of spreads and explodes into a mighty titanic war between two nations, Japan and China, and that goes on to 1945. And then you have a lot of people who actually say in later debates, well, look, actually, Manchuria, Dongbei, it's the northeastern provinces of China, they get invaded and occupied in 1931. And those people get to count as part of the wider Japanese campaign in China in the first place. Indeed, there are many left-wing Japanese who, from the 1960s onwards, I think, started to talk about there being a 15-year war between the early 1930s and 1945. Some people who really want to push the boat out would say, well, actually, the first Sino-Japanese war is in 1894-5, which literally ends with the ceding of Taiwan as a colony to Japan. And then in some ways you have low-level warfare between China and Japan all the way through to 1945. So that's a 50-year war, if you like. Now, there was plenty of robust debate around the two more kind of mainstream positions. I would say the majority of people looked to 1937 to 45 as the well-recognized term. And then others said, well, no, actually, it's 1931. And this was, academics had endless fun debating which of these was actually the real answer. And then for a variety of reasons, largely political in the end, the state decided that it would decree that there was an answer to the question. I think that happened in, I want to say 2017 or 2018. The person who would know this in detail, I'm going to give a shout out here, is one of your fellow Washingtonians, the scholar Dr. Emily Matson, who I think is teaching at Georgetown, and she's got a book coming out, I think next year, called The Date Debate, which is precisely about this question of whether it's 1931 or 37. She's read a lot of Chinese scholars who have written about this issue. But to summarize briefly, essentially, the state party put forward the idea that the aggression starts in 1931. I suppose this means that you can pin a much longer period of confrontation on the Japanese, which may have its own political purposes, and therefore 1937 is no longer on the agenda as an official start date for the war. Now, I would say that most historians in the West who look at this question, and really quite a lot in China if you ask privately, are not very happy about this. The reason being that if you think about the period between 1931 and 37, well, there's no doubt that the invasion of Manchuria was a major aggressive military act. I wrote my first book about the subject. There's plenty of periods in the following 2 or 3 years when there's a truce, there's an attempt to try and patch up relations, and it's not really till 1937 that you get the outbreak of full-scale war. Also, it is the case that at the end of the war itself, and for decades afterwards, whether you were in the mainland or Taiwan, everyone else thought they had fought an 8-year war. So basically coming around decades later and telling them, well, actually, you were having false consciousness. You were really in a 15-year war, a 14-year war all the time, is a little bit like the kind of Groucho Marx line, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? So something that I think should be a question of historical interpretation, with, to be fair, actually valid interpretations both ways, has now been turned into a test of political loyalty that essentially, to follow the official line, you have to say the war began in 1931, specifically on the 18th of September, when the Guangdong Army the Japanese occupying force launched a coup on a railway line near the city of Shenyang and then expanded their occupation from there.
And so clearly there are certain rules, political rules, that Chinese historians have always needed to contend with. But it does seem like probably even since you published that book in 2020, Chinese historians have had to navigate an increasingly inflexible set of political rules and expectations. So I wanted to ask just what is the state of the field right now for historians in China?
The field of history at the moment in China, I think, is without doubt being subjected to more constraints than would have been the case certainly 20 years ago, and maybe even 10, I would say. It does depend a little bit what aspect of history you're doing. And here I'm talking mainly about modern history. I mean, there are controversies around the Ming Dynasty and even more ancient history too, as well as archaeology, which actually is highly political in various ways. But sticking to the modern history period, the late 19th and 20th centuries, I would say that, first of all, the single most contentious area, and it always has been, but it's particularly tight at the moment, is party history. In other words, the history of the Chinese Communist Party itself. Now, although, of course, it's always been immensely sensitive because the CCP has always wanted to put forward a correct and objective view of its own history, which involves leaving out, various purges, rivalries, and other figures from the past who no longer fit the narrative. Nonetheless, there have been periods, 1990s, early 2000s, when memoirs, sets of documents, things even that people put on garbage heaps and then were kind of bought up and sold on, were available in terms of giving a more complex and nuanced story about what really happened in the party's history. And that kind of thing is now harder to write, certainly for Westerners. I mean, again, there are examples of people managing it very well. Again, shout out to Joseph Torigian of the Hoover Institution, who's just published a fabulous biography of father of Xi Jinping. The book is called The Party's Interests Come First, and it's just out this year. So that's an example of what can be done with huge amounts of really hard work. But publishing a book like that inside China is pretty much unthinkable at the moment. And even the kind of memoirs and other documentation behind it would be much harder to find than would have been the case. Another example, actually, another great book, Robert Suitinger published, I think last year, a book called Conscience of the Party about Hu Yaobang, one of those sorts of figures who is kind of in the grey zone of history. He's not actually banned, unlike his successor, Zhao Ziyang, of course, fell from grace during the Tiananmen Square massacre. But nonetheless, the sources that underpin Dr. Suitinger's book, he says in his footnotes, have now been taken off the websites where they were available within China until recently. Beyond that, some of the other aspects of modern history are perhaps less immediately sensitive. I'm thinking here about World War II. There's obviously a lot you still can say, particularly in an anniversary year, but maybe some of the ability to talk more broadly about the role, say, of the Kuomintang. That is something that is perhaps more narrow than it was a few years ago. And there's one subject, which again I've addressed in another one of my books, The Forgotten Ally, which is about the history of World War II in China, which is those who collaborated with the Japanese, and particularly the figure of Wang Jingwei, who was the major collaborator on the Chinese side with Japan. He is still a very, very sensitive figure, to use the preferred euphemism on this. In other words, controversial figure. And writing about him, even mentioning his name, can be problematic in a lot of historical contexts. So there's still plenty of areas where historians can trip up if they come up against the boundaries of political permission when it comes to writing history.
Well, perhaps that serves as good a transition as any to your foreign affairs piece, The Once and Future China, which imagines a version of the Chinese nation that is bound by fewer of these political rules and restrictions. You argue in that piece that the generation of Chinese leaders who came of age during the Cultural Revolution, including, of course, President Xi, may interpret China's interests and historical experience quite differently than the generation that grew up during the liberalizing period of the 80s, 90s, and even the early 2000s. And you note, I'm quoting, these future leaders may see value in moderating China's authoritarianism in ways that would make it more powerful. What lessons does this generation take from Chinese history, and how does that differ from Xi's worldview?
Very much, Henrietta, for kind of pointing out exactly what I wanted to get at in that article, which is that generations make a real difference. And I think it is worth noting that Xi Jinping, and those around him, but Xi Jinping in particular, are the last generation of leaders who will have been shaped or their childhoods will have been shaped by the Cultural Revolution. And again, there's no great secret about the fact that Xi himself was deeply affected by that period. It's well known, in fact, written about extensively in the Turigin biography I mentioned of his father. But I think that it's fair to say that that experience must have had something to do with the real kind of fixation with order and trying to avoid any kind of chaos, as no doubt Xi and the others would see it. But of course, what that often means is that space for civil society, for people to kind of, make private decisions, essentially not to be under the kind of wider ambit of the state. Even though Xi Jinping himself, we don't yet know, may well take what will become a fourth term, maybe even beyond that in office. It's a fair bet, I think it's fair to say, that the others around him will observe these standard retirement ages. And the next generation coming up, and the generation after that, 5 year by 5 years, will be people who, at least in their younger days, do have memory and experience of that period of relative openness in the 1970s, 1980s, and even beyond. Now, I want to be clear what I tried to get out of the article. I don't think that this means a sort of mythical, what would you call it, sort of glowing in the distance that many people seem to see for a long time, that China was going to essentially become a full-scale, multi-party, liberal electoral democracy. My own analysis is that for a variety of reasons, that was always not impossible. I mean, the case of Taiwan obviously shows you can have a Chinese-based society that can produce a very functional, indeed very lively, liberal democracy. But for a variety of reasons, mainland politics, I think, didn't lead in that direction. But they did lead previously in the direction of the authoritarian system allowing more space for different types of semi-civil society and institutions to actually have room to breathe. And much of that room to breathe has now been sort of squeezed out in the last 2 years. I think there will be an interest, particularly as the world becomes more complex in different ways, and China has to engage more with the outside world in the next few years as it seeks to reboot its currently stuttering economy, to learn from those lessons of a period of openness. The people doing it will be top members of the Communist Party. We shouldn't be under an illusion as to their willingness to let go of their stern grip on power. I think that's not going to loosen. But in a strange way, I think the wider direction of global politics may make them more confident about loosening up somewhat. Because the world that we're moving into in the 2020s and 2030s globally is one that is more friendly to governmental systems that are less liberal. Not necessarily illiberal, but in some cases, at least, pushing back against the idea that a kind of fully pluralist society is the ultimate goal of what a society should aim for. And while China will always, I think, be at the kind of more extreme end of a really quite top-down Leninist type of society, there's probably more comfort level for China in loosening up somewhat in a world which it feels is broadly going its direction. I should say, for the avoidance of any doubt, because I think it is worth saying, I personally think that the world would be a lot better if it were actually operating at a level where there was more pluralism and more liberalism throughout. But I think the Chinese Communist Party will be looking out for the way that the world is going, as opposed to the way the world would be if more liberal societies were more dominant in a way that perhaps they were 15 or 20 years ago. And that may paradoxically give them more confidence to open up somewhat within their own system, particularly, as I've said, with their younger set of generations who I think are coming up through the leadership, not just in terms of the party directly, the Politburo and so forth, but also in terms of business, media, and other aspects of wider society in China. Don't expect instant changes, but do look out for change within China itself. One of the greatest mistakes I think outside analysts can make is to assume that China is unchanging, when in fact, over time, it actually changes frequently and often rather surprisingly.
You do highlight an interesting thread of continuity in the piece. You raise two Qing-era slogans or goals regarding China's modernization, and they are rich country and strong army, and Chinese for essence, Western for usage. What does this mean to Xi today, and what might it mean to the next generation of leaders?
So these two phrases, Henrietta, you're right, 富国强兵 and 重提西勇, are phrases that have a much longer history. In the case of the first one, actually, it goes way back, but certainly it became very prominent in the Qing dynasty when China felt under attack from the outside world and was looking for kind of internal modes of thought to revive itself. And the second one, Feng Weifeng was one of the thinkers who popularized it, the idea that even if you had to learn from the West in terms of technology and industry, you need to keep your own cultural essence strong. So, Chinese for the essence. And I think both of these ideas are things that Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, and the wider nationalist project of the last, 100 years or more, has had at its heart. I say that because, in a sense, again, I find this a sort of paradox, and I say something about this in the article, that if you look at what you might call not the short term or long term, but the medium term, say a 20-year stretch, actually stick a pin in a calendar of the century. And if you were to take all of the data that you have at your disposal at that point about China, and as a responsible, sensible, restrained analyst, if you try and extrapolate in a straight line from there to where China might be in 20 years, you would almost always get it wrong. In 1900, very few people would have thought that 20 years from there, the empire would have collapsed and China would be a kind of warring warlord republic. In 1960, the Sino-Soviet split saw, the two great communist giants of the Cold War about to really have this sort of violent quarrel with each other about the nature of socialism. 20 years later, Deng Xiaoping is leading China on its experiment in market capitalism under socialist rule. So a 20-year gap in China throughout the last 100 years or so has in practice often led in some highly unexpected directions. But those two themes you mentioned, rich country, strong army, and also Western learning but Chinese essence, I think continue to be at the heart of the debate that's going on in China today. How can it create a sense of itself as one of the great powers in the world that is with us now and to come? And a term which is often, it's got a very kind of social scientific feel about it, 综合国力, comprehensive national power. It's a term that many China analysts have seen. Well, actually, although it sounds, very much like it's been made up by political scientists, that term is basically 富国强兵, rich country and strong army in a slightly different guise, straight out of the Qing dynasty. And beyond that, the debates today about, well, is China a Marxist society? Is it a Confucian society? When Xi Jinping personally authorized a TV series about 2 years ago, which I actually read about it also in Foreign Affairs, which had two actors dressed as Confucius and Marx debating about which one was really at the heart of Chinese communist thinking today. That debate about different forms of thought and what's indigenous and what comes from outside, again, that whole Qing dynasty debate is contained in something that was being broadcast as recently as the year 2023 on Chinese television. Everything changes, but nothing changes.
It's incredibly illustrative. And you note in the piece that the international environment will be secondary, of course, to internal factors in determining whether China would embark on this more conscientious path that you imagine for it. You mentioned that that path may be more achievable in an international environment that feels safer for Beijing's own system of government. But beyond that, if the US wanted to encourage this trajectory for China, short of ceasing to be a democracy, how could it best do so?
The ways in which we're seeing global politics going anywhere. I think this is true actually really for the last couple of years, the Biden administration. To some extent, I think it seems to be true of the current administration, is the idea that actually the United States and the West is not necessarily in the business of going in and changing countries from the inside. It's proved incredibly difficult to do and often doesn't work out. I mean, if you think about the first time around with China in the 1940s, the whole debate about who lost China was based on the premise in the 1940s and 50s that somehow the Chinese state was a country that was America's to lose in the first place. And in the end, it was actually domestic politics between the nationalists and communists that really was determinative of that shift. I would say that one of the things that has been both necessary and hard for the US to do over the past few decades remains a very important task, which is to work out where it has allies in the world. And the United States still has many allies around the world, in Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere. And we'll find that they are of value and very keen still to work with the United States if the invitation and the opportunities are there. And then to use that set of networks, friendships, many of which go back, decades and decades in terms of their depth, to think about the question of what is the relationship with China supposed to look like? Now, I think nobody, certainly including the current administration, believes that China is going to disappear overnight or, its current system is going to change overnight. But many of the things which have, I think, given China an upper hand in the wider world at the moment. Just let's take one, which again I talk about a bit in that foreign affairs piece you kindly mentioned, which is the question of post-fossil fuel energy. Those are the areas where right now the United States doesn't have a very clear or obvious story to tell to many of the parts of the world that you might say are kind of global swing states, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, where the energy hunger is huge and real. The emerging middle classes are also huge and real. They still have huge interest in the US as well as the West in terms of education, business opportunities, but they know that China is real as well. Giving those people an offer, whether it's about the future of the internet, of 5G, of green energy, of how science is going to develop, about what's going to happen over the next pandemic, having an integrated positive story about what the West, with the US very much in the lead, should do about that, I think is the kind of positive narrative that we need more of out there. I think in those circumstances, it's perfectly legitimate to let those countries then hear what China has to say. But the West and the United States really needs to have a good alternative, a good answer to make it look as if actually taking the path that leads more towards a more pluralist and more democratic society is actually an attractive option rather than the least worst.
So I think to some ears in Washington, the argument you're making that there's some responsibility on the part of the US or the Western world to create an environment that feels more welcoming and safer for China would feel to some somewhat self-serving on China's part, is I could imagine an argument that China actually adopted a more aggressive and revisionist approach in a very welcoming moment. So how would you respond to that?
Well, no, I don't think the point is that it's a more welcome move for China. I think China has already made itself an extremely powerful actor in the world. And really, it's in many cases, I think, for China to show that it's willing to actually be a genuine partner as opposed to a transactional one to a whole variety of emerging new societies and voices in the world. I think what I wanted to make it clear enough, perhaps I'll do that now, is that the wider world needs to be more welcoming to the newer actors who are coming on the scene. For a very long time, the dominant players, and they still are dominant, are the United States, European Union, China, of course, the last 20, 25 years has become a globally, very, very major player indeed. And we shouldn't forget, key actors who are still there, like Japan as well. But 20 to 25 years ago, I don't think people would have been talking, they weren't talking collectively about Southeast Asia and ASEAN as actually a grouping that may have significant agency, bargaining power, purchasing power in its own right. They would not have been talking about the way in which increasingly important actors, say in places like West Africa, Nigeria, and so forth, are going to also be places that are not just important now, but will be immensely more populous and important in 2030, 2035, 2040. And indeed, places like Brazil, which has been pretty much in the headlines in the last few days as we've been speaking, is a place that is not only, of course, one of Latin America's largest economies, one that at the moment is looking towards China, but perhaps can be, given alternatives, that these sorts of countries are now in a marketplace for affiliations, for ideas, for new stories about energy, for economic opportunities. It's those countries for whom the welcome mat needs to be put out there. And I think that's the challenge to the United States, to China, to the EU and other actors as to how they're actually going to make a convincing case to those actors that as the journey goes forward in the 2020s and 2030s, that they have something to offer there. I think the question about China being in the world is in some sense not in doubt. China is now, the second biggest military in the world, second biggest economy in the world. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. But I don't think the rest of the world needs to worry about making the wider ecology comfortable for China. China is quite comfortable where it is. The question is, what are China, the US, and the other major actors going to do to actually accommodate the next generation of rising powers whose affiliations and preferences are still fluid and can be shaped?
We'll have to wrap there. Rana, thank you so much for coming on the show. To learn more about Rana's thinking on China, you can read his recent foreign affairs article titled, again, The Once and Future China, How Will Change Come to Beijing, and his most recent book, China's Good War. And to our listeners, we'd love to hear what you thought of the show and which guests you'd like to see on Pekingology in the future. You can send your ideas to pekingology@csis.org. Rana, thanks again.
Thanks very much indeed, Henrietta. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.